get started, this session is on the USWDS system and how we've used it at the EPA recently in their migration to Drupal 8. So we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to try to get these through so we have enough time for questions at the end. My name is Dan Mouyard. I'm a front-end technical architect at Forum 1. And I've been working in web development for over 20 years and Drupal itself for over 12 or so. I typically work on large enterprise sites such as Peace Corps, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the Environmental Protection Agency, which I'll talk about in more detail during this presentation. I'm also a maintainer of the Gesso theme, which is a starter theme we use here at Forum 1 on most of our Drupal projects. And the best way to contact me is through email. Here, dmouyard@forum1.com. You can also find me online at dcmouyard. That's my handle on GitHub, Twitter, Slack, and Drupal.org. So now that you know a little bit more about me, let's get started. So here are the three main questions that I want to answer today. One, what is the US web design system? Two, how can you use the US web design system in Drupal? And then finally, how did the EPA integrate the US web design system for the Drupal 8 site? The bulk of my time will be spent answering this third question, so it's more specific and not too many other people would have the knowledge behind how we did it at EPA. So first, what is the US web design system? Before I dig in, I want to take a quick step back and talk about design systems in general. A design system is a series of components that can be reused in a variety of ways. They can be put together in different combinations, in different locations, and still look like they belong to an organized, coherent whole. Legos are a great analogy. When we build a design system, we're designing the Lego bricks, the individual bricks that you can reuse to build a variety of objects. When done well, all of the things that you build look like they're part of the same family with the same consistent branding, look, and feel. And here you can see some example pieces of the design system that we put together for the Peace Corps website a few years ago. So you can see there's colors, there's icon, typography, and you work all these things together, sort of mix and match and make it scalable as the design gets larger and larger so you can easily come up with new components on the fly. So the US web design system is simply a design system for the federal government. There's a lot of great documentation and examples at designsystem.digital.gov. There's all kinds of information on the various design tokens, components, utilities, and page templates. And it's also chock full of wonderful background information, such as how to adopt it incrementally, lots of good information on accessibility and usability best practices, as well as they really go into detail on some of the design principles that underlie the entire system. So some of the main benefits of using the US web design system are that it's a pre-made design system. You can either use it as is or use it as a starting place for your own custom design system. It's also actively maintained and is continually improved upon, including new components that are added regularly. In fact, they just released version 2.9.0 this week. It's accessible out of the box, and it has a really unique, wonderful color system that allows you to easily combine colors in accessible ways. And finally, it's free. There are some drawbacks, however. As Susan Fagan at EPA loves to say, it's free as in puppy, not free as in beer. So there still requires a lot of time and budget you need in order to get it to fit to what you need. There's also costs associated with, maintenance and general upkeep to get it, to keep it running. If you're using the code itself and not just the general design guidelines, one drawback is that it is complex. There are a lot of moving parts and pieces. It's a pretty complicated code base, especially the Sass structure and how you can pull in, where you define different theme settings and how you think things to tweak it how you want. So I want you to think of it as like a car. So it has some very easy inputs for like steering, gas, and brake. But if you really want to customize the experience, you really take, an expert mechanic to dig into the code and tweak it exactly how you'd like. So just as this code, there's some easy ways that you can set kind of general fonts, typography, colors, and that kind of stuff. But for some really nitty-gritty details, it does take extra work. And one analogy I can think of is Bootstrap. So it's very helpful and easy if you're just putting markup on a page and you want it the library to take care of the styling and the behavior. Once you get to the point where you want to customize how it looks and feels beyond just simple color and font changes, it can sometimes be more hassle than it's worth. So now for the second question, how can you use the USWDS system in Drupal? So for the rest of this presentation, I'll be focusing primarily on the code of the USWDS system itself, rather than some of the colors and design guidelines that you can use if you're doing your own design system. So first, you can manually add it to your theme. Go to the USWDS GitHub page, download the zip file, the latest release, and copy those files into your theme. The download also has Sass files. So if in your theme you already do have Sass compilation kind of up and running, you can use those as your starting point. And one key point is that you can't really set a lot of the theme settings and variables in the library unless you do have Sass up and running. And you also might need to do more overriding of the design system styles with your own style sheet, not using the Sass approach. Another option is to use a package manager, such as NPM or Yarn. And you pull in the web design system library that way. This way you don't have to worry so much about finding and searching and downloading and installing the correct file that you've downloaded. You just let the package manager handle all the grunt work. And then finally, you can use an existing Drupal theme. The two themes currently out there are USWDS and USWDS_base. The main difference is that the USWDS is the sub-theme of the classic theme that ships with Drupal core. So it inherits all of those styles, behaviors, and stuff like that. Whereas the USWDS base theme kind of strips all that out and you start from a clean slate. Neither one, however, has Sass compilation out of the box. But there is another GovCon session tomorrow called Drupal and USWDS. It's time to get things started. And there, Brian and Dustin will walk through how to use the USWDS theme, that first one, to add gulp to compile Sass and to go through how to use it, what the interface looks like, and lots of cool stuff. There's also, in fact, an USWDS admin theme for Drupal. I just found that out this week, but there's no releases yet, so I'm not sure what it looks like yet. There's also a USWDS paragraphs module that works with the USWDS theme. So for those of you that use paragraphs to kind of help you build your site, you create a different paragraph type that you can put in. And the theme creates some sort of pre-made out-of-the-box paragraph types that kind of match with the USWDS components, such as like the hero, callout, stuff like that. So now for the main part of this talk is how did the EPA integrate the USWDS system for the Drupal 8 site? So before we get into the details, I'll take a look back at some of the recent evolution of the EPA website. So the year is 2011, and the EPA website is kind of a hodgepodge of different systems that have sort of been cobbled together over the years, with a lot of it in just flat HTML files. And so they came to us at Forum 1 and we sort of worked together to sort of migrate and get everything set up in Drupal 7, because that's the CMS they had chosen. They loved it, great things about it. And so in 2012, we started on that work. And we see here, we didn't really change the design, but we did try to clean up some of the inconsistencies. So this was, try to clean up some of the typography, the spacing, so it's all kind of the same, and rather than being like, 10 pixels here and 12 pixels there. So we really try to make it more consistent and work together kind of its own design system. And in fact, it was actually the last project that I started on before switching to Sass, SMACs, and BEM naming conventions. So it was definitely old school as far as front-end technology goes. We still tried to modularize everything. We were just getting into the mindset of kind of like object-oriented CSS and trying to work through things so that makes it easier to maintain and keep up to date. So it was definitely less spaghetti code than some of the older projects that I've worked on, but it was still sort of a stepping stone into how we approach things today. So in 2016, EPA did a design refresh. It kept the same markup and code in Drupal 7, but we wanted to update sort of the style to match the US web design system. And so it was a little bit rough because the front end code base was still, a bit outdated. It didn't have Sass. We didn't really have a full budget to sort of completely rebuild the theme from scratch. So we sort of had to shoehorn the US web design system styles onto existing markup. And there were some complications. It was definitely tricky to make sure everything was still working and only put in the bits and pieces we had. So it was kind of a hurdle and sort of a challenge to keep up with the latest versions of the web design system. We always had to do things manually, and over time, we gradually updated bits and pieces of the site. We incorporated new US web design system components, such as the government banner you see here at the top of the page. So when it came time, last year, we were approached by EPA and they want to update to Drupal 8. And so there was a project where we would migrate to Drupal 8 and so migrate all the content, but we were able to rebuild the site from scratch. That includes both the back end and the front end theme. And so it came time to decide how are we going to approach theming of this new Drupal 8 site. And so there were a few requirements. First is the EPA doesn't necessarily spend a lot of time or budget on the design. Like they have a specific design they like and they want to stick with it. And most of the design actually follows the US web design system. So they wanted a way so that we could always easily keep up to date. Whenever there's a new change in the web design system, we can easily keep up to date, track those changes and easily pull them in. Whereas before, like in 2016, it was a much more manual and tedious task. So that was kind of the number one requirement. Number two, we wanted better documentation. So in the old Drupal 7 site, they had built out, a couple different pages of their own style guide where they went into real detail on this is what boxes look like, this is how you use them, this is images, this is how the grid system works, like all the nitty-gritty details that content editors need when they're creating a website. And so we wanted to have good documentation for the new design and the components on this new Drupal 8 site as well. Because one of the drawbacks of the old style guide page is that the documentation isn't tied to the code anyway. So anytime we make code changes, there's usually some lag time before somebody has time to sort of update the documentation to match what is in code. So we were hoping to have something that was kind of more hand in hand for this project. Another requirement is that we did want people who were familiar with the US web design system to be able to just get on this project and feel comfortable using the style, Sass, and markup. So at Forum, whenever you try to do project, on a big government project like this, you might not always be the vendor, and so you want to have things so there's a lot of good documentation, there's a lot of good pieces in place that it's easy to maintain whoever comes in to sort of work on it. And so one of the key things is we wanted people so that if they are comfortable with as I said, all the Sass mixins and stuff, they can easily come in here and they'll feel comfortable. Another one is we wanted it to be sort of a modern front end. This was particularly a kind of a pet peeve of mine because on the old Drupal 7 site, it was from 2012. And so there's a lot of modern front end changes that have happened since then that we want to take advantage of, things like Sass, things we want to use like, how the Sass is architected, how we use fonts, how we use JavaScript, and all that stuff has really changed over time. And so we wanted something that's sort of modern and up to date and makes it a lot more easy and efficient for themers to do the job. And then finally, we wanted what's called theme familiarity. So we wanted people to also who worked on other projects at Forum 1. We have a lot of different projects going on, and sometimes we may switch projects. And so you wanted something that when they switch from project to project, they can easily slot in and sort of get to work without having to spend a whole lot of time getting up to speed. They can, in essence, hit the ground running. So they already know how the code is architected. A lot of their, mixins and functions that they like to use are already there that they can use and take advantage of. And so what we ended up doing was we started with the Gesso theme. So the Gesso theme, it first came out as the Drupal 7 theme way back in 2014. Actually, not too long after the EPA project is whenever we started this whole approach. And the Gesto theme kind of foreshadowed what was going to be in Drupal 8. So we really followed the Drupal 8 CSS architecture guidelines and how things should be organized, named. So there's a lot of there's a lot of thought that went into the architecture of the Sass. So like it follows the SMACS architecture. It uses the BEM naming conventions. We use Sass to compile it. It also has a lot of other things that we've built into it over the years, our own custom functions, JavaScript functionality. And we've also integrated it with Pattern Lab. And there's a bunch of other conversations, videos and stuff you can probably find online of where people talk about the Gesto theme and how it integrates with Pattern Lab. Now that the Pattern Lab had Twig and Drupal 8 had Twig, you can sort of kind of combine those two into a single system. And so that's another reason why we thought Pattern Lab would help us with the documentation part. And so we ended up going with the approach where we used the package manager, in our case NPM, to pull in the USWDS system library, which we effectively call GUS. It's not really the official name. I think the official name is Gesto-USWDS. But it's a way that we can sort of combine both worlds. And so it's in essence pulled in their library. And so we can easily redo it so that we can pick and choose what we want from the USWDS system. Rather than just loading all the JavaScript and CSS, we get to pick and choose what we want because we might not be using all of it. And it sort of helps with maintenance and performance. So here we can see this is all that we're doing. It was just pulling in the package file. It was just saying, okay, pull in the USWDS system library, 2.9.0. And that's all it is. And so it takes care of pulling everything in, and then currently we use Webpack to sort of bundle all of the assets that we want from USWDS alongside our source files. That way we're not manually copying. So for now we're manually copying the fonts and images into the theme, but we're hoping in the future that we can hook this into our Webpack itself, so even that won't be manual anymore. So I'm going to get into some code details. This is sort of an intermediate talk and an expert talk, so I'm just kind of breeze right through these real quick. So let's get through this. So first, one of the key things in the new version of Gesto is we have things that are called design tokens. And so with these, we have, we used to have things that were like in Sass would have these variables, like what colors are, how wide things are. And then we have separate variables in Twig, so this is what the site name is, this is, whatever. And so we ended up figuring out a solution where we use YAML files. We put all the information data in YAML files, and then our build system spit that out to both Sass and Twig so that we can use it in both places, and it's sort of a single document for truth. And you can see here as an example how we define some of our colors in the design token. And then we have in Pattern Lab, it automatically gets this information and it outputs it. So whenever we make changes here, it updates it in Pattern Lab. And as well in Sass, we can use mixins and stuff to pull in these values. Here's another example where we define the font families and stuff. And so what we did for GUS is that we added a section in the design components for all of the USWDS like theme settings and variables, so that we just have one spot that we can set it, and then that gets set, and all of the Sass and other mixins from that library inherits it, so it kind of flows through everything. So here's an example of what we have for updated for palettes, for example, where we added the ability where we can actually put in Sass functions. So here we're using the color mixin or the color function from USWDS to say what that particular color is. And unfortunately, we do have to provide a fallback for just for Pattern Lab so that the right value gets output on the screen. Here's another example where we can pull in, using the color function, we can pull in whatever themes settings and Sass variable set in the system, as well as any kind of theme USWDS specific token that we defined earlier in the file. Okay, so next in Sass. So basically, the Sass in the USWDS they have theme settings where you can define like what colors, what font sizes, kind of the spacing that you want to use. And then there's a lot of really good helpful utilities, mixin placeholders that you can extend, as well as functions to kind of get through everything. And we wanted it to be the theme set up so that if you're familiar with the UX design system and all of the stuff, or if you're familiar with Gesto, either one works. So we put a lot of work into making sure that, you know, whichever mixin or function you use, you're going to get the exact same output. You know, so you can see some examples here of, you know, on the left-hand side is some of the functions that you would use, you know, from the UX design system, and on the right is kind of the appropriate what you would use in Gesto. So regardless to whatever you're familiar with, you can easily get into the code and make the changes you need. So one exception was setting font sizes. So in USWDS, they do something called font normalization, which adjusts the font size depending on the font family to account for, like, you know, different X heights and other font metrics. So that is kind of the one exception. And then finally, this is how we include, you know, one of the components in Sass of USWDS system into one of our steps. And all we do is just import that component. That's all we need to worry about. The Webpack pulls everything in from the library and handles everything else. So that's the Sass. Next is the JavaScript. And this was a very, very easy step for us because how they've architected the JavaScript in USWDS is it's a modern, you know, modular approach using ES6 modules, which is what we used on the latest version of Gesto. So it's very simple. Like, all you need to do is pretty much just, you know, import the specific, you know, JS module you want, and boom, you can pull it in to our scripts. Okay, so finally, I want to talk about is Pattern Lab. And this is going to be kind of the demo portion. And so what I want is, you can see the link on the, actually, let me go to it. So Pattern Lab is sort of like sorry, I got ahead of myself. So Pattern Lab is kind of this tool where you can sort of see, like, it can be sort of like a tool for like a living style guide, pattern library of what the different components are. And the way we've wired it up is that we use the same twig files that are in the theme that generate the Drupal markup, also matches what's in Pattern Lab. And so now for the demo part, and all of you can follow along. If you go to dcmouyard.github.io/EPA-pattern-lab, I put a quick snapshot of kind of a recent version of the Pattern Lab that we've been using on the Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 migration on EPA. So I'm going to leave it on the screen up for a little bit so you can all get that information while I will switch over to share my screen to the other one. And I'm going to okay, so hopefully everybody got the link and they're able to see the demo. So here is the Pattern Lab implementation, and you can see we've done a lot of customization that kind of fit what EPA wants. One is we've created sort of an initial kind of a welcome page, so you can easily write some text to sort of say, hey, this is what the library is, this is our underlying reason, this is our strategy, all that kind of stuff that you might want to go over. So the first thing I'm doing here, let me switch the theme. I like the dark color theme better, so I can easily move around. So this is based on Pattern Lab, so it's very similar to the atomic design process that Brad Frost came up when he came up with Pattern Lab. We did tweak it a little bit at Form 1 to sort of more closely align with the SMACS approach of how we organize our CSS. And so basically what we have is right here, we have the global stuff. So this is all basically like the default, think of them as variables as well. Like, what are the colors that you might want to have? What are the font families you might want to have? What are the default spacings and kind of the stuff that you might pull into other components or mixins or functions. Next is the base. And so this is basically where we define the styles for all of the base HTML elements if there's no classes applied. As you can see here in HTML elements, we go through like all the headings, what do they look like, all the different block level elements and inline elements and paragraphs and lists and that kind of stuff. We also have in here for date formats. So like in Drupal, we can define what the date formats are. So on different display mode, teasers and stuff, we know which specific date formats we want to use. We also have defined stuff for like the images, as well as like so different image styles, as well as responsive images, and how we can pull those into various components. The next section is, this is new that's different from Gesso. So this entire folder is stuff that's from the US Web Design System. So this is all of their components. You know, you can see here, like this is their accordion component. And we do add some documentation as far as with links to where you can see some of the examples and where they talk about it in the documentation of the US Web Design System. And this is for all of the stuff that's there from the US Web Design System. The next are the layouts. This is sort of like the general layouts of like maybe the grid system or maybe different layout components, like for example here, the header, you know, or maybe the page layout, you know, or the sidebar layout. That's kind of like where we define those kind of large level bookshelves where we can sort of place these individual components. The meat of it is in this components where you can see we have all these various different components. You know, you can see here we have all these various different variants of the box component, you know, so that they use throughout their site. And they have all kinds of documentation on, you know, when it's best to use it, when not. And so that's where all the components are. And then templates are, this is where it kind of mixes in with Drupal, where this is where like the node templates and stuff kind of pull from these. And so this is where we can have kind of like also set up in Panel Labs, kind of a demo content of this is what a bunch of, you know, default stuff would look like, headings and stuff, and then how we pull in figures, and if they're photo left or right with boxes, pull quotes, videos, stuff like that. And then these, we also have this pages at the very end. And so these aren't tied to Drupal at all, but they're sort of like, we build these as sort of mock-ups of what it will look like in Drupal. You know, so here's what a full page would look like, you know, in Drupal. And we have some variants. So like we have one where, you know, if you're logged in and you're an admin, you know, this is what it looks like if there's a status message, you know, and you see the local task. And they have a functionality where you can sort of hide and show the admin info. So we wanted to sort of demonstrate that here before we build all these things out in Drupal. So hopefully, okay, so I'm good on time. I did want to leave plenty of time for questions. So let me switch back over.
Yeah, there are a few questions, Dan, so
okay,
whenever you
sure.
get to it. Do you want to go ahead with those now?
Sure, yeah, why don't you go?
Well, the first one was really just, is your slide deck going to be available to download somewhere?
Sure, yeah, I can add it as a link to this session, probably as soon as this is done.
Okay. You can upload it on the GovCon website too, if you wanted to do that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to do on the GovCon website.
Okay. And then another one was, which Drupal version of USWDS did you use?
So we did not use any of the themes that are currently out there for USWDS. We sort of pulled it in our own into the Gesso theme. And we did a bunch of work up front, which became the Gus theme. We tried to do as much there before we got into EPA specific stuff so that in the future we could reuse this on other projects if needed. And also EPA is they're pretty gung-ho about being able to share their work in the open source community. And so this was kind of a way to sort of give back some of the work that they've commissioned.
Okay, so to clarify, you guys used USWDS as a starter or a base for your own design system, right?
No, so we used the US Design System. We're
right.
pulling it in, but we're not using any other themes.
Right. You're not using any Drupal specific themes, just the core US Web Design System.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, so there's another question. Why use USWDS versus something like Bootstrap?
So the US Design System is I think they've done a lot more good work on accessibility. They've done a lot more good work on sort of doing like some of the usability testing and stuff. And they put a lot of thought into their components. And although I've kind of said it's very complex and it takes a lot to get into, it's still a lot simpler than a lot of other systems. That if you do want to override it, there are ways to do it. And I think if you're working on a website that's part of the federal government, you probably want to use the USWDS system as opposed to Bootstrap, even if it's just for a simple wireframe of a simple page. Because this design system, people coming to the site generally think, oh, this is part of the US government, which is kind of helpful for folks.
Okay, so there's a question that says, is the USWDS component directory in the pattern lab completely inherited from the USWDS package that is imported, or is that in the pattern lab source directory?
So we are pulling in the USWDS library through NPM. And so none of that stuff is in the theme itself, except for I think fonts and images. Those we've manually copied in. Everything else gets pulled in and output via our Webpack configuration. And so Webpack is basically like a module bundler that bundles everything up and outputs it. So it grabs stuff that's needed, from the node modules folder, for example. So none of that stuff is in our theme per se, but it gets built out through Webpack. But we do have, so one of the drawbacks of the library that doesn't have any markup defined anywhere. So we have to define our own markup in Pattern Lab that matches up with the markup that the USWDS system is expecting.
Okay. A lot of questions coming in now. Do
Sure.
you recommend using, or do you recommend starting from USWDS or USWDS base? Could you explain their differences a little more?
So my recommendation is basically take a look at both of them and see what fits in more with your approach. So like when we first started out with this, I took a deep look into both of those. This was a year or so ago. And we ended up not choosing that. We went up our own route. But sort of like the main difference I talked before is basically just that the USWDS theme is the base theme of classes. So it pulls in a lot of the styles and stuff that come with Drupal core, whereas the USWDS underscore base theme doesn't. And so you might have to provide more styles for some of those Drupal specific components. But it's sort of a cleaner slate and you have less to override. So that's kind of the choice you need to make when you're starting a project.
Okay. And I think that also kind of goes with the next question. What cons do you see with using the Drupal project USWDS base or just the standard USWDS, I guess, starter?
So I think some of the drawbacks is, one, there's a lot of stuff missing in those themes that you might have if you're routinely working on a lot of, modern front end stuff that if you're used to stuff like on Gesso, with Sass compilation and Pattern Lab, or if you're familiar more with the Multiply project and Storybook and all that kind of, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of in those that, developers that work on a lot of projects get a lot of benefit out of. And so those two things don't have any of that stuff. So you have to kind of figure out a way to sort of to pull that in. So you can either, start with one of those themes and add your own stuff, or kind of pull it in like we did into our theme.
Okay, great. So this next question is one that I'm curious about. I've used USWDS as well, so I'd like to hear your take. What are some things you would want to see improved in USWDS that would have made building your theme easier?
So the biggest challenge for us was really the default styles for base HTML elements, because those styles tend to flow in and bleed into every other component. And so there were some things that we had to override, just based on spacing. Like they use an approach where, this is even kind of nitty-gritty technical, but we use an approach where, something plus something. If something has, a parent, a sibling before or after, it adds spacing, which is a really cool, unique approach. But on base component, pages, HTML, like on a paragraph, where you have a lot of paragraphs and things are folded left and right, that can really cause a lot of inconsistencies and breaks things. But in general, all of the components themselves, they're very well structured and self-contained and easy to use or not use.
Okay. And let's see, there's a question specifically about Gesso USWDS. Is there a plan for Gesso to migrate to USWDS 2 since import has been deprecated in favor of Sass modules? Is there just going to be a new version of Gesso USWDS, or is it kind of a restructure or a complete recoding?
So it really depends on how much use we're going to get out of it. So this is very useful for the EPA project because they had the requirement that you need to easily be able to update the US design system as needed. And so on a lot of other projects, I might not recommend using that approach. I would probably, on a custom site, probably more say use the design system as a start, but sort of design your own system separate from that. So using it as a guideline. And so if we don't have a lot of projects where we need to, we might not be putting too much work into having new versions. But if we do, we'll definitely be looking into using Sass modules. And so like we'll be updating it to 2.9.0 and because I think right now Gus is at 2.4.0, so it is quite a bit out of date.
Okay. Let's see. If I use Bootstrap theme, is there an easy way to use USWDS with it instead of creating a new theme?
Unfortunately not. So using something like Bootstrap or just USWDS system itself, it has a lot of styles and expectations. And so Bootstrap and USWDS, they use completely different markup. And so you have to be really picky about what you pull from which is really great if you're just doing kind of a quick, rapid prototyping, you know, or you don't really have the time or budget for like the design and theming of a site. You can just plug that in and quickly build up your site very easily. But once you start getting into, you want customizations of how you want it to look, that's where it becomes, you know, more troublesome to use Bootstrap.
Yeah, I think those two would be really fighting against each other quite a bit if you use both. Okay, great. Is the USWDS or Gesso Drupal 9 compatible?
Right now, no. We are currently in the process of getting Gesso up to date with Drupal 9. And we're hoping to have that ready probably this winter at some point. And then most likely shortly after that, within a couple of weeks, probably, we'll probably update it to Gus as well.
Great, okay. Any other questions? There's been some real good ones. Going once. Dan, you got anything else you want to add?
Let's see. I guess I'll just say kind of some of my final thoughts and recommendation. And that is, I think the US design system is an extraordinary piece of work. They've done an excellent job designing it, thinking it, packaging it, and documenting it. And I think it's a great boon for federal agency to use that in their process, whether they just use it as sort of inspiration, whether they use it as a starting point for their own design system, or like EPA, they're pulling it in directly, and that's where the majority of sort of their design comes from. I think some of the, I guess what I would say is for the US, I guess for Gus specifically, just a USWDS theme is it's very beneficial if you need to keep up to date with any changes in the US design system, and you want to keep up to date with those. It's very important it's a very good starting point if you want to pull in individual Sass components of the system and not the entire library. It's also very good if you want to pull in like the JavaScript modules that I talked about. It's a very convenient and easy way to do that. That said, it is hard. I'm not sure I'd recommend it on a project where you're starting with it, but you're going to be customizing it to the point where it looks like your own site. Like you get a lot of the benefits of the UX and accessibility stuff of the design system, but you really want it to make it look like your own site, for example. The more customizations you need, the more I would hesitate against using the Gus theme and probably incorporating the USWDS system into your own process for designing a, living style guide, whatever your process is, whether that's Gesso or Emulsify or some other approach where you build your own sort of living pattern library style guide.
Okay, there's a question, a couple of them. Is USWDS mandated for use on all federal sites, or is it best practice?
I believe for now it's just the best practice. I haven't heard anything where it's mandated,
Right.
but it is strongly recommended.
Yeah, I can also speak to that. I know there are a large majority of sites that are making moves to get onto USWDS. In some cases, it's just not possible, but it is highly recommended. I don't think it's enforceable right now, but that's not to say that it won't be. Let's see, there is another one here. Can Gus be used on other sites, or was it custom to this site?
So Gus is pretty much, it's like Gesso. It's a starter theme that can use on any project. It doesn't have any EPA specific stuff in it.
Okay, I actually have a question for you, Dan. Can you speak to some of the 508 compliance issues around USWDS that maybe you worked on specifically to your build for EPA and this design system?
Sure. So luckily, any component that we pulled in, such as, like whether it's just styles, like the hero component, or if it also has some added JS functionality like accordions, all of those were accessible out of the box. We didn't have to do any sort of special tweaks or custom things. The design system also has, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, they had a wonderful sort of like color system, and the way you can easily, how they name things, you can easily see whether two colors, there's enough color contrast. So it's very easy to sort of, eyeball things and not have to check everything in a color contrast tool. So that's really cool. Yeah, so no accessibility issues that we came across from the design system that we needed to fix.
Okay, great. Yeah. Any other questions? We've been getting some rolling through. Anybody else? Okay. Oh, let's see. Just a comment here. USWDS just did an accessibility review for all user components, and the accessibility looks great.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, that's good. Is there a state and local group I can join?
For USWDS, I'm not sure. I know they have some Slack channels that you can join that has a lot of information, and once a month or so, whenever they'll have, whenever there's a new release, they'll do like a quick
Right.
announcement in the Slack channel, and this is what changed, these are the new components. So
I think they do a video or some kind of a live stream explaining some of the new features as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, great. I think we're good with the questions. Dan, thanks so much. Hope everyone learned something.